you have to, if you're John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay, and you're an economic and nationalist, as they're going to begin to call themselves, you believe in good government, the Erie Canal, right? That's an instrumental part of improving transportation, lowering costs, the printing press, the fact that the newspapers proliferate, public education. It's a moral and it's a physical idea. So I'm setting the table for what Adams is going to propose in his presidency. And it's going to be bold and it's going to be controversial. And we're going to say 200 years later in this setting, so, I mean, pretty tame, pretty run-of-the-mill things that the government might suggest and lead in these areas. But back then, it was controversial. Now throw that controversy in with the idea that the Adams presidency to some isn't legitimate. So how can this guy step out and suggest these very bold ideas? That's the question people are asking. So many an American who is rural, urban, poor, middle class embraces this ethos, this idea of intellectual improvement. We have to look at one person who's a teenager during this time, Abraham Lincoln, with his book By the Firelight. Now, this idea of, the log cabin and you invent your own backstory, Lincoln didn't need to. The log cabin, reading by the fire, he did all that. William Henry Harrison, not so much. Came from a very wealthy Virginia family. The log cabin campaign of 1840 is just a nostalgia that wasn't there. But ever since then, candidates for office, whether it be state office, national office, or president, kind of have to, sometimes be somewhat creative with their story. Although, nowadays it's harder to do that because you leave more of a footprint with documents and on the internet. So to come up with those things, it's just easier to admit that, yeah, you did smoke pot. I mean, as opposed to a previous candidate who said, I did, but I didn't inhale. It's like, what? Oh, come on. It's like that time I tried beer and I put it in my mouth and then spit it out. And I was like, nah, I'm not going to do that. But no, it's back then you could come up with the idea. What's that?
It's weird now that be cool, it's cool for residents that, yeah, smoke pot.
Yeah, I mean, it was Bill Clinton in '92, and then within a few years, Barack Obama's like, yeah, did it a couple times, So I mean, it's in his autobiographies. Yeah, just come out there and admit it. Yeah, exactly. So anyway, so getting back to this idea that you have to be the engine for your own personal improvement. It mattered to Lincoln for himself. It mattered later to Illinois when he tries. This is why he becomes a Whig. The Whig Party that emerges in the 1830s is perfectly suited for what Lincoln and Adams and Clay are talking about. It has both a personal and social benefit. There are secular ways to, not religiously tied, and there are religious ways. Finney and Beecher showed that. The Second Great Awakening is tailor-made for faith, can be a way that you improve yourself. So this very powerful conception is what John Quincy Adams had in his mind and applied it to his presidency. He represents, like his father, another man of talent and virtue, and the intellectual ability above reproach to any who are around him. Again, this is the reputation of John Quincy Adams. In an age where presidents were well prepared for the job because of public service, he's no exception. Maybe the most prepared individual for president, which doesn't mean you're going to succeed. Congressman, senator, diplomat, what else? Secretary of State. He had done a lot during his life. Despite all of this, Adams was not fated to enjoy a successful term. Part of it was his fault. Part of it was out of his control. In other words, it kind of mirrors, unfortunately, his father. By his peers, he is, to a fault, serious, hardworking, devout, with granite integrity and a somewhat cosmopolitan flair. He's a world traveler. He's seen different parts of Europe and the United States. So certainly that would all line up. The heritage is there from his father. a direct connection to the American Revolution. His own idea of improvement meant a detailed writing of a diary and daily swims in the Potomac River. Sorry for this image, naked. Disrobed, jumped in the Potomac, swam. I wouldn't swim in the Potomac today. Ugh. Even with a, yeah. So, and that's what he did. And there you go. He believed in the American experiment, with the United States being that example. He said the U.S. would be a steamboat of moral and political being, unquote. A steamboat, to use a modern technological achievement since the War of 1812. He is also the most learned president since Jefferson and in between, I would say, Jefferson and Wilson, as far as his own intellectual background. That makes him, consequently, on the other end, pretty ill at ease in a lot of social settings. So we might say he doesn't have that common touch. By the time of his presidency, he is 57 years old, gaining weight, even though he's swimming a lot, balding, and never able to develop the charisma of his associates. And that probably hurts him.
Presidents, him and Martin Van Buren are the ones that get that good. Just his portrait.
Martin Van Buren?
Yeah, I don't know why. He's just disturbing.
Okay. Yeah.
Just the look on his eyes.
Well, this is someone who's rapidly ascending through New York politics, Van Buren at this time.
Yeah.
So yeah, he's definitely in this story in this time period. He's also on the flip side that maybe hurt his presidency, brooding, very critical of those around him. So suffer no fools idea, as the expression goes. But he also says a lot of this scorn for himself, critical of himself. He did, like his father, though, marry up. Mrs. Adams is, again, just described by everyone as a fantastic individual. A lot of people said the same thing about Abigail Adams. But unfortunately, it doesn't really help him in the presidency. He comes into office beginning of 1825, and he is acutely aware of the election. So he makes reference to the fact that it wasn't the traditional way you would like to ascend to the presidency. He knows he's a vulnerable minority president. Again, he finished second, and he became president. Finished second in the electoral vote and the popular vote.
Was he the youngest at the time?
The youngest president to ever be president?
Well, no, like at this time.
At this time.
I think so.
Washington was 57, I want to say. 1789, he would have been 57.
Oh.
Yeah.
I thought he would have been.
Yeah. Adams, I think, was older. I don't know up to this point. Yeah. I was talking about 1960 and 2020, and everyone said Kennedy was so young and he was going to be the youngest president if he was to be elected, which he was. Like there's a generational thing, which is true, but the guy who ran against is 4 years older than him, Nixon. So, you see the picture like, oh, and then Nixon's kind of sweaty and shifty looking. And, well, there you go. There you go. But this whole thing about, connecting, Nixon's of a different age, like he's born in the last century. It's like, no, they're 4 years difference. If Nixon had been elected in 60, which some people think he actually was, he would have been one of the youngest presidents. I mean, at right up there with TR, who comes into the presidency after the assassination. But yeah. And Kennedy was also, tan, rested, ready, and probably pumped up with a lot of prescription drugs that were trying to finally understand were part of his regimen for his pain, his back pain that he got during World War II. So yeah, he's up there as one of the younger. Monroe's a little bit older, and I think Jefferson would have been in his 60s as well. But yes, I mean, this is a guy who lives until what, the eve of the Mexico War. I mean, his last national statement effectively is when they talked about I think it was a financial bill. What's the word I'm looking for? A bill to fund the war. And he stands up, John Quincy Adams, and he begins to shake, turn red, and say, "No!" And he just falls over. He just drops dead. I mean, they had the spot in the Capitol marked to this day. where he just collapsed. They carried him off to a side room, and he died. I mean, he was just. And don't forget, he practiced in front of the Supreme Court several times. He wasn't. The movie gives him more. Amistad, a fantastic movie about the slaves who sued for their own freedom, but he helped shepherd that case through the Supreme Court, and he was attached to it because it was going to give the cause and the people involved more standing. But yeah, his post-presidential career is really impressive. Worked to repeal the gag order, which is where you just squelch and cut off all debate about slavery issues. And he said you can't do it. It's a violation of the First Amendment. But that happened afterwards. Now we're talking about his presidency. And he says, and the quote's there in the notes, he realized he was less possessed of your confidence in advance than any of my predecessors. So he acknowledges that, the way he got to be president. It is a stark contrast, the 1824 election, from the one 4 years before. Let's keep in mind, Monroe in 1820 wins every electoral vote except one that was cast for John Quincy Adams, it turns out, just because they didn't want it to be unanimous. The electors said Washington should be the only president who wins the unanimous electoral vote twice, and not Monroe. So it couldn't have been greater, this idea of ushering in the era of good feelings in 1816 and 1820, and then Adams comes into office. But he takes the opportunity, does Adams, in every measure to make the era of good feelings continue, to link the continuity between the two administrations. That's what his goal is. He, of course, raises a few eyebrows when he declares with conviction that national unity can best be promoted through a program of internal improvements. Not everyone agrees with that. He promises, quote, unborn millions of our posterity, unquote, would be grateful. No pressure, right? Future generations will thank you if you were going to support what I have in mind. When he finishes giving his inaugural address, he takes the presidential oath of office from John Marshall, the guy who his father appointed as Chief Justice 24 years before. Yeah, he's still around. That's kind of interesting. Yeah, right? I mean, he's there. His father sees him elected.
But he didn't go to see him be inaugurated, or did he?
No, he did not. No.
That would have been even awesome, like, to see, like, I don't know.
It's a creative scene that we clipped that we looked at last time. The idea of reading the letter from Jefferson, and then Quincy unable to kind of read it, getting emotional, handing it to his wife, and at the end of that quote, or the end of that clip, John Adams, I don't know if it cut off before, John Adams says, I don't want to be reminded that I'm an old dotard, which is a word not people use, just a kind of an old man who can barely get around. And John Quincy Adams' wife looks at him and says, yeah, we don't want to be reminded either. And so, pretty sharp. So John Adams is like, yeah, okay. But, okay, so Jackson steps forward. You want to talk about awkward moment. You want to talk about something I would have loved to have seen. One of those wish I had been there times. Andrew Jackson steps forward to shake his hand, which they do, and it is the last time the two men ever display any form of civility between Jackson and John Quincy Adams. In fact, Jackson will stay in the Capitol long enough to cast a vote against Henry Clay as Secretary of State in March of 1825. And later that year, in October of 1825, the Tennessee legislature nominates Jackson for president in 1828, and Jackson then quits the Senate, resigns. And, if you're going to run as an outsider, run as an outsider. Yeah. And he resigns the office. So Adams refuses to admit or to concede the idea that this so-called era of good feelings should come to an end, and his inaugural says it all. I mean, maybe the unrealistic hope that he will be able to lead that fragile coalition of one-party government that had worked for James Monroe through various crises. We can go through them. Obviously, the Missouri crisis, the Panic of 1819, which the country is now fully beginning to come out of by 1825. So he pledges that the baneful weed of party strife was uprooted, unquote. Not so much, but hope springs eternal. And he wants to create a truly nonpartisan administration. And so he leaves, like his father did, he leaves a lot of the Monroe people in place. He even offers Crawford, the ailing, he had the stroke in 1823, to remain in the cabinet as Secretary of the Treasury. No, he refused to take that invitation. In the end, some that remained in the cabinet jobs, he hopes will form the basis of this consensus government. It's going to be people he knew, people who he thought were talented. He should have maybe learned from his father that that's not always the case. John Adams kept Washington's cabinet, and they were all just Hamilton people and not really John Adams people. Of course, Henry Clay at the State Department, represents the most important cabinet position in the first quarter of the 19th century because it is a springboard to the presidency. It puts him in a tough spot. So it's a coveted part of the cabinet. At the same time, the taint of the corrupt bargain will haunt Henry Clay until his death. He never can shake loose of the deal he made, which wasn't a deal, but it seemed like a deal, so that's what counts. But he also couldn't decline the offer. How could he say no? And the president asked, can you accept? It's certainly a way to facilitate your own presidential aspirations. And it turns out the corrupt bargain tag to Adams and Clay, but I think more to Clay, that you would accept this, that you sold out the will of the people. I mean, Adams finishes second. To make the offer, I don't think a lot of people hold him as accountable as Clay. Clay can never just, it just sticks to him. It's just an anchor he has to wear for the rest of his political career. It's a bit unfair to Clay, but it makes sense for Adams. You put together a coalition government, you put together a group of your rivals. The man who finished fourth for the presidency is now in your cabinet. Okay, why not? Generation later, it'll make sense for Lincoln to do that. All of his rivals become his inner circle. And the other part is that it fits into this narrative that the Jackson people had put out there. If you remember the 1824 campaign, we have the publication of what are called the Wyoming Letters. This was the idea that there was political corruption in Washington, D.C. It had to be rooted out. You need someone like Jackson to move in there and make it happen. And it didn't happen. Jackson was basically denied the legitimate presidency, and the corrupt bargain only reaffirmed, according to the Jackson people. Now, they're not part of a political party. We're not going to say the Jackson Democrats, not yet, but you've got the Adams and Clay people, you've got the Crawford folks, and you've got the Jackson people in the government. Go ahead, Kate.
It's funny because back then it was shocking that DC was seen as being the most corrupt city, but now it's like that this was to come out, we would be like, well, this figures. It's like
right.
More, it's just.
Yeah, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy that was predicted by this literature printed to help get Jackson elected. That he didn't write, but people around him wrote. Yeah. It's to clean out the government. It's whatever the modern drain the swamp we've used, throw the bums out, whatever terms we've applied over American history. That one party stays in. Now, it was the only party, remember. So this idea of get out the incumbent. John Quincy Adams is part of the problem, as is Clay, as is Crawford. So this is what they were saying in 1824. So you need someone who's not connected to all of that. You need someone who did the honest work of annoying both the British and the Spanish in Florida. And everybody, and blowing up the fort there, the Negro fort in West Florida, scaring off the Spanish, all that stuff, international incident. So he's the alternative. But I mean, what's really happening is that this Jeffersonian one-party government, it's splintering, and Adams doesn't want to acknowledge it, but it really is happening. The first year of his time in office. Now, we know that what you would have done back then is give your State of the Union, they called it an annual message. You gave it before the session in Congress, which usually happened in December. So in December of 1825, it is Adams who I think really almost dooms his presidency by putting forth these very bold, not by our standards, but by then, initiatives to set an agenda for the United States. And it makes sense in a lot of ways. The European wars are over. I mean, had been over for 10 years. There are new nations in Latin America. So he's casting his eye on improvement in the United States and overseas as well. We're looking to become a world player. And let me scroll this up so we can see the notes a little better. There we go. There's an aftermath of the panic, the first nationwide depression since the American Revolution. So with that in mind, with that being the course of recent events, it's time for the U.S. to kind of go on and chart something of a bold course of action. It just makes sense to Adams and others. He is famous for the phrase liberty and power. Liberty and power go together. There is liberty in power, which a lot of people think, how can there be liberty when you are asserting power? Well, if you think that the government at the state and national level can be a force of good, that phrase doesn't have the negative connotations. To increase the role of government is bad or good. We have a love-hate relationship with government. We say government is too powerful, but we usually ask for government to be more powerful so it can do more things. And it's the only institution that can possibly make lives better for people. And Adams was keenly aware of that, and that is the core of his belief. So his cabinet told him, you might want to, with the way you came into the presidency, the mindset of other people, hold off on some of the things that you are proposing. But Adams just said, nope, I'm going to go ahead and go with it. He says the first year is the best opportunity, maybe the only opportunity, to move the nation forward in these new areas. And so he saved the best for last. Did he deliver this personally? No. He wrote it, though. And it was then sent over to Congress, and someone would probably read it for anyone who was assembled. And that would be probably most of the senators and representatives there in Washington. So he proposes an ambitious and some would say startling package of different measures. It was going to accelerate the building of roads and canals. Again, we have one national road by the national government. But roads are being built by the states. They are developing the turnpike companies, and they are taking it upon themselves to improve their transportation networks. The establishment of a Department of the Interior. Ooh, controversial then, not so much today. A national university. Okay, makes sense. Financing scientific expeditions and exploration and research. Creating a naval academy. Sounds like a good idea. We have an Army Academy, West Point. A national bankruptcy law that would allow you to be protected and to reset your financial future if you were to have to declare bankruptcy. Again, the idea is changing, that sometimes events are beyond your control. Remember, alcoholism was a failure personally before people realized it is a disease. The same with bankruptcy. Once you were bankrupt, that's it. I mean, you obviously screwed up, and your financial life going forward is going to be really hurt. A national uniform of weights and measures. The contemplation of adopting a metric system like Europe was doing. We never really got into that. Building a national astronomical observatory. Like, oh, yay. Or today we'd be like, oh, this all sounds really good. There were 130 national, in some form, around the world, observatories in the world. There are none in the United States. So he says, why not? I mean, he also talks about a national depository for the artifacts and things we treasure in the United States. And that he got together with a guy named James Smithson. the Smithsonian Institute. But then there's a whole book written account about that partnership. And here you go. This is at the very end of this, annual message, 1825. So it's really the first year of his presidency. Adams then finished, after laying out all of this agenda, with a quote: "Were we to slumber in indolence, or fold up our arms and proclaim to the world that we are palsied by the will of our constituents, would it not be to cast away the bounties of Providence and doom ourselves to perpetual inferiority?" Unquote. That's part of a quote that kind of came back to haunt Adams. Palsied by the will of our constituents. Some people thought in 1825 you should be, maybe not palsied, but, be responsive to the will of your constituents. This is a guy who used the word democracy unapologetically. So it's almost like, a warning, a dire warning. Let's do what's best for the country in spite of what all of you in Congress have to vote on and what the folks back home thought. So that little quote I read you came back to haunt him. The reaction was instantaneous. One congressman asked, "Are we reading a state paper or a schoolboy's thesis?" Thomas Jefferson believed it would make consolidation of the executive branch complete. He didn't want that. Remember, Jefferson's revolution retrenched the role of the government. And now his friend's son was doing exactly the opposite. Left and right, wherever your political alliances are, those who supported Adams and hadn't trusted Jackson begin to flock to Andrew Jackson beginning in 1826. 1826 is kind of the pivot year for the Adams presidency. Adams will face an uphill battle simply based on his election and all of the rumors surrounding the corrupt bargain. Some of his opponents are already lining up in Congress. One of them, John Randolph in the Senate, from the group called the Old Republicans. Yeah.
Okay. If they were to see how America is today, would they have made a bigger deal about these? Because if we focus more on some of these, we'd be better in education and all that, I feel like. Because he just wanted to make something more accessible to everyone.
Right.
I mean, it wasn't that big of a deal. They're just mad that the normal people will get education and get access to all this stuff when it was their right, I feel like.
Yeah, that's a more modern mindset, absolutely. But back then, the idea of these kind of initiatives coming from the federal government made people nervous.
Okay.
Made people nervous. Power taken is not given back usually. That's the experience the classically educated folks in Congress and the Senate thought. There's also, of course, the specter in the room, right? What's that? What's the issue? Yeah. It gets back to the quote, if you can create a bank, Congress on Wednesday, the Congress can end slavery. So yeah. Well, while people were talking about improvement, they weren't talking about improving that way. Yeah, because you left that alone. Otherwise, it's political suicide. You become marginalized as an abolitionist or someone who favors slavery. So it's kind of an agreement over that issue. Nothing is said about it. So John Randolph, kind of he considers himself something of a purist in the Jeffersonian sense. He's from Virginia, and he's the worst person you could have as a critic. Randolph is to be feared as an enemy. He hates economic nationalism. He hates Henry Clay. And he also wants to frustrate John Quincy Adams. In the first session of Congress, he delivers a characteristically inflammatory speech filled with insults, calling the Clay-Adams administration. Now, I'll explain this reference. People knew it back then. This is John Randolph. Quote, the coalition of Bliffle and Black George, the combination, unheard of till then, of the Puritan with the black leg, unquote. All right, what does that mean? His audience gasps in shock and explodes into laughter when he makes this quote. These are characters from a book that people were reading back then. And remember, folks, people in the 1800s used to read for fun. Write that down, discuss amongst yourselves later. Okay, we'll just keep going.
I still read for fun.
I know, it's just the joke I'm making.
History majors tend to do that.
What's that?
History majors tend to be the people who read too.
It's just an idea that, I mean, this gets back to my mentor at LSU, who we used to talk about Uncle Tom's Cabin and why did a book have such an impact in the 1850s? And he stops and said, write this down. People in the 1850s used to read for fun. And it was a novel that made an impact. Anyway, so what is the reference here? Bliffle and Black George, the combination unheard of till then of the Puritan with the black leg. It is an allusion to a popular pop culture of the time. Like if you were to reference a song today or something that was on the internet or a movie, line in a movie. The book is Tom Jones by Henry Fielding. Bliffle in the book is a sanctimonious hypocrite. Black George is an irresponsible scamp. Characters from the book. To call someone a black leg meant you were a card sharp.
That's what was that?
Hmm?
Card sharp or sharp?
Sharp.
Okay,
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. And it's a direct reference to Clay because he, for years, had been trying to live that down. I don't know why that screen does that, but anyway, there you go. The gambling and the drinking and the carousing, which par for the course when you're on the frontier. So everyone knows what he's referring to. The Puritan with the black leg. Sure, it's Tom Jones by Henry Fielding. Which makes me think I've got to go find a copy of that book at some point and put it in my summer reading list. Those 19th century stuff sometimes hard to read. I mean, Uncle Tom's Cabin is an important book, but it is sentimentalist fiction, meaning critics don't think it's the best written book, but the message is the important part of it. Yeah, and it feels dated. I mean, the way people talk. When you read James Fenimore Cooper, you're like, whoa, 3 pages on a tree. I mean, come on. But that's how people wrote back then. Yeah.
I tried to read it, and I was way too young. I was like in
Exactly.
elementary school.
Yeah, you got to set the context.
I can't read this because
So this charge by Randolph in Congress comes, not long after the corrupt bargain charge, and it's just too much as far as the black leg of the quote is concerned. This is going to, of course, generate a challenge to honor, which you think, oh, it's 1825. Surely people don't. Yeah, they still do. They still duel. Dueling was still very much part of the Southern Code. And Clay's from Kentucky. Clay had forsworn the practice as a way to improve himself, right? No more cards, no more drinking, no more late nights. I got to take myself seriously now as a politician. And one of the things, like the teetotaler idea, you would sign the pledge. He basically took a pledge to no longer fight in a duel. Lyman Beecher had been, someone we've referenced before, critical and trying to stop dueling as a national way to settle one's honor. Clay forgets his pledge and decides to throw down the proverbial gauntlet to John Randolph. On April 8th, 1826, both men exchanged shots at 10 paces. Now let's keep in mind this is the current Secretary of State of the United States and a sitting senator. I know. Can you imagine now? This would be.
gosh, like,
Hate to watch that.
I would, I'm serious, like,
People clubbing each other in the Capitol. I'm like,
with this class, and I'm looking like at the classes I think I'm gonna be like an early American history, like, it's like so good. I'm telling you.
All right. All right.
Sorry.
No, it's fine. No. And what happens with this whole thing? You know, Henry Clay, the man of the frontier, a man of the South, he's awful with a gun. You just assume someone who lives out in that part of the world where it was still rough and tumble in Kentucky. You know, he was born before it's actually a state. He's terrible. He missed both times, John Randolph. His second bullet grazed Randolph's coat. Randolph fires into the air the second time, not wanting to actually aim directly at Clay. And at this point, honor seems to be satisfied. The two men shake hands and go home. It is a major embarrassment for the president. The Secretary of State had just fought in a duel. Hadn't done well either. Okay, fighting the duel is the embarrassing part. I'm not going to say that Adams says, didn't he shoot the guy? Oh, he didn't? No, too bad. Randolph rather enjoyed the whole thing.
So technically, he did. He hit the coat. He was wearing.
Okay.
So, I mean, he didn't hit the body, but he hit something on the body.
To Randolph, it just enhances his reputation. He goes back to Virginia, and everyone's like, yeah, that's great. It scored him a lot of political points. What also hurts Adams as his president begins to crumble is an unexpected opponent, and that's his vice president. We said that at the beginning of the 1824 campaign, there were 5 gentlemen interested in being president. One is John Calhoun. John Calhoun kind of not renounces, but he just takes a step back and says, I'll take, the front runners are clearly Adams and Jackson. I'll take a step back and serve as vice president. A scant 4 years before, Adams had written in his diary that Calhoun was, quote, above sectional prejudices, unquote. Great, and he's in your inner circle as vice president. Remember, they had served together in the cabinet. Calhoun, Secretary of War, Adams, Secretary of State. By 1825, John Calhoun is no longer above sectional prejudices. He is not aiding the administration. He is determined to distance himself from Adams. And that's not good to have effectively a disloyal president. You expect the vice president to, you pick him or her because of, you hope that the individual can take the presidency if God forbid it happens that you have to. But there are also, some presidents and vice presidents keep a cool distance. Others work together fairly well. It just depends on the administration. The start of the story is that Calhoun wanted to be Secretary of State and tried to talk Adams out of appointing Clay.
Okay. I was just thinking with the dueling, it's like when Cheney shot the guy hunting, right?
Not quite.
But he had the guy.
That wasn't, yeah.
But he had the guy apologize for being shot by the.
Yeah, he said, "I'm sorry, my face got in the path of his shotgun." Yeah, that was just bizarre.
So, I mean,
Yeah, literally. It didn't phrase it that way, but you get the idea. You're absolutely right. He said sorry that I had to go and get shot.
So, I mean, so that kind of was like an embarrassment to George Bush's administration at that point, because,
Well, maybe a little, but I think it played into what a lot of people thought about the vice president, was that he is a human version of Darth Vader. If you watch Vice, the movie, that's certainly the impression that you get.
it's just so funny that guy went on TV, on
Yeah.
national TV, and apologized for being shot.
Well, I think it meant to reinforce the idea it was an accident. It was
Yeah.
not done purposefully. And but look, it gave me great things to talk about when that administration was in office. I talked about the Burr duel. You thought Aaron Burr was the only vice president to shoot somebody until Dick Cheney. So anyway, Calhoun, he's going through this real political conversion, we might call it. So he didn't get the job he wanted. Again, he tried to talk Adams out of appointing Clay, but Clay is the Secretary of State. He feels betrayed, but I don't know how that was going to work in Calhoun's mind because he was vice president. So if he was going to, well, yeah, maybe not. Maybe not. Yeah.
Well, now the fact is the Secretary of the State is like what the vice president is today. It's like a stepping stone.
In some ways, yeah, absolutely. And Calhoun's beginning to see the writing on the wall. You know, am I going to be able to actually, you know, forward my agenda of becoming president at some point? I stepped back in 1824. Look, you do the math. 8 years of Adams, 8 years of Clay, because if the Secretary of State job is a springboard, and he's wondering if he's going to be alive and young enough to still see his chances. So with this corrupt bargain, it really makes Calhoun understand, all right, my chances to become president are beginning to ebb away by 1825. And so it's an estrangement of two folks who worked in the administration who Adams called above sectional prejudices, not so much by 1826. There's a lot of personal ambition there. And the other change for Calhoun is that his home state is changing. This is what, there is some truth to this idea that when you're in Washington, you're part of the problem, and you've got to go back home sometimes and, you know, remove yourself from Washington and go back. Now, the cabinet and Congress didn't stay in Washington as much as they do today. There's a session of Congress, sometimes two, but there was an accusation from Calhoun by people in South Carolina that you don't understand how the state is changing and you're not reflecting of that change. So what's changing that creates this, what I would call a Calhoun conversion, a reinvention of his political priorities? I think Denmark Vesey, which we talked about, the 1822 abortive slave conspiracy that happened in South Carolina, means that for this part, any moderation or any kind of political core ideas that favor nationalism, you can't have them anymore in South Carolina, or you won't be elected. So you're out of step, Calhoun, with what's happening in your state. So is he attempting to reconnect, but by changing his political stripes? That's the question we've always wondered since then. Maybe even throw in the Missouri crisis with that as well. That would be another factor. You've got people running in South Carolina, James Hamilton, who helped root out some of those who were plotting in the conspiracy. And again, was it as many as we think were involved? We don't know. Or was it just panicked by the white officials and said, you know, everyone who was of African heritage, you're involved in this, and we're going to overreact. So you start to see the election of more radical and states' rights-oriented congressmen in South Carolina. That's what's taking place after 1822 and 1823. So that the makeup of the politicians in the state is changing, and maybe Calhoun is reacting to that. A Secretary of State, John Adams, Quincy Adams, was upset that the state of South Carolina had basically said, we're going to incarcerate any black sailors who come into Charleston while their ship was in port, so that they wouldn't go out and, of course, start another slave rebellion. He thought that that's a violation of the civil liberties of folks who are not American citizens. Now, that opposition to that policy kind of got John Quincy Adams in trouble with the state of South Carolina, where they basically thought, easy for you to say, you know, it didn't happen in Massachusetts. Even if Calhoun wanted to cooperate with Adams as his vice president, it would have been very difficult and awkward for him. The other factor that's happening is the South Carolina economy. Cotton prices began to tumble in 1825, and this is cruel because it just had been coming out of this national depression, the Panic of 1819. But the people think in South Carolina and in the South, not what we might consider worldwide events are changing the demand, or, you know, God forbid, hey, overproduction of cotton is driving the prices down. That's what really the reality of it is. No, the villain, not this time the bank, is the 1824 tariff. Tax on imports. That's why the demand for cotton is decreasing. Why wouldn't it decrease? Because we have this tax on imports coming in, and these other countries are going to retaliate in what we would call a trade war. As Dr. Dollar has always said, no one wins a trade war. When it happens, it's not good for either country. Calhoun decides within the Adams administration he can no longer support the nationalist agenda of protective tariffs because of what's happening in South Carolina. The legislature passes a resolution, the legislature of South Carolina, their state government, passes a resolution declaring internal improvements and the tariff are unconstitutional. Ruh-roh, as they say, not good. Calhoun spends months in South Carolina, the first time he had done so in years. So it's like, oh, welcome back, Mr. Vice President. Nice of you to, show up here and get your finger on the pulse of what's happening in the state. That you should have been doing, exactly. Reconnect with the folks, as they say. Town hall meetings, you know how well these go when you have congressmen and senators getting yelled at by their constituents. You can understand why people don't want to do that if you were a senator or congressman, but you have to. It should be made to do it as far as I'm concerned. But the new vice president accordingly commenced what he calls, in his own words, a breathtaking reinvention of himself. Some would call that political flip-flopping, whatever, or a reinvention. That sounds like a modern term. As people in modern times do that. I was against this. Now I'm for it. Why? Well, I've had a breathtaking reinvention of myself.
With the three strikes rule.
Yeah, you can go. Yeah.
But now I'm saying it was a.
I was for the war, then I was against it. I opposed gay marriage. Now I'm for it. I mean, people, reinventions. Yeah, they change their minds. Or they would say mature, develop, they use other words. And that's fine. It happens in politics. It happens in everyday life with people who change their mind about things. But this is really from one end of the political spectrum to another. This is a 180-degree change for Calhoun. As running mate of Adams and then later Jackson, Calhoun said, I tried to be neutral between the two during the 1824 election. Again, he was going to serve as vice president under one of them. Didn't matter all that much. By 1826, he is, as vice president, actually debating against the Adams administration in newspapers across the United States, and then offers Andrew Jackson his support. Again, not a very loyal vice president. The two reach an agreement, Jackson and Calhoun, that's brokered by the scariest president that Caitlin thinks exists. Martin Van Buren. Maybe you're not looking at the right portrait. I'm sure there's another one of.
Just the one I see.
All right.
I don't know why.
Martin Van Buren. Somewhere there is a clip of Martin Van Buren, a very famous actor, played him in Amistad, where he has the cabinet there with Calhoun. I'll have to see if it's online. We'll have to see that. Anyway, so there you have it. The agreement is now between Jackson and Calhoun, brokered by Van Buren. And that would enable Calhoun to serve once again as vice president under a successful Adams administration. Now, this fast forward and fast tracks Calhoun's career. Why? Look at Andrew Jackson. This guy ain't going to live for 4 years, let alone serve for two 4-year terms. So it speeds up the time he has to wait.
Isn't this what Jackson said him and Adams did, was make a deal, so he just think that they're level too?
Yeah, but maybe, but
So what's the
no
difference?
one thought anything of it. Why? Because when you make the deal, it's okay. It's called it's double standard, of course. It's the oldest trick in the political book. Encouragingly to Calhoun, Jackson states presidents should serve but one term. His policies, however, are unclear. What does Jackson think about national issues? He won't tell you. And that's perfect, because you can sell him as Van Buren does. You can sell him as a candidate everyone can endorse. Right, from the mechanical employee in New York to the plantation owner in Tennessee to the yeoman farmer who's working, cutting the swath through the wilderness in Alabama. He appeals to all people. Why? Because he says nothing about the big national issues, but he's someone who can get the job done. You can understand why he runs that way. So the powerful Richmond Junto, as they are called, in Virginia, the Albany Regency, which Van Buren is a part of, swing in favor of Andrew Jackson by the end of 1825. Before Adams's first Congress even meets, we have a determined opposition to the Adams administration, simply called the Jackson Men. Yes?
What was the group that Van Buren belonged to? The Richmond?
The Richmond Junto, Junto. This is the Virginia group. Junto, the Junto, they're called.
Thank you.
And the Albany, New York, reference to the state of New York, Regency. Again, catchy names, right?
It's like,
The Squad.
yeah.
The group of more progressive congresswomen. Yeah. They've had ever since then. Economic development, of course, is one area where there's contention between Adams and Calhoun, and again, the Richmond Junto and folks like John Randolph. Adams is controversial over Indian affairs. We always pin this on Andrew Jackson as the president who did finally move Native Americans, and he would say because my predecessors failed in doing this. As Secretary of War, Calhoun in the Monroe administration was responsible for resettlement of Native Americans across the Mississippi River, which they've been working on doing for years. We think it's all a part of Jackson's time in office. That isn't the case. At the same time, you want Indians to move, but you also want them to assimilate. So it's the lie we've been telling Native Americans: live like us and you can live among us. That didn't fly. The assimilation also meant stay where you are, and implied at least to Native Americans. People in the American Southwest, Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia didn't like this. They also covet the land that is occupied by the Creek and the Cherokee Indians. In some cases, not to the speed of the people in Georgia and other parts of the Southwest, voluntary removal was not taking place. I was going to move on to smaller areas of land within the state, and then maybe with the possibility of a permanent up and settlement somewhere in the West. Things get messy at the end of the Monroe administration that signs a treaty with the Creek Nation that they will move out of Georgia and go to the West. So the Indian removal idea is not new in Andrew Jackson's time. It comes to light that Georgia and the federal commissioners had bribed the Creek leader who signed the treaty. His name is William McIntosh. So shenanigans involved, once again, with Georgia and Indian policy. This state does not have a good track record with Native Americans, you can understand. The Creeks refused to sign the treaty because of what was happening, the collusion that took place. And then McIntosh himself was assassinated for having sold out the Creeks, and made them move. Adams sided with the Indians who stayed. The treaty is not legitimate. The treaty, according to Adams, is null and void, but Georgia said, nah, it was signed by somebody, that's good enough for us. So Georgia insisted on implementing the treaty and started to survey the land where whites could move in. To the credit of the Virginia Secretary of War, and that would be really the only southern state that said, basically, no, federal authority has to maintain the Creek land, which is unusual because you think of the South, you think of states' rights. But there's an argument here in Virginia. I mention it because it's the idea that, no, the states might be able to make treaties, but the federal government makes the treaties with Native American nations, and those are the ones that are and have to be in place. That's what the Virginia official was arguing. The Creek helped prevent another showdown when they sign a different treaty, one that they see as legitimate, and then agreed to sell their land in a better deal, moving the Creek out of Georgia, the Cherokee stay. Whites throughout the South basically thought that Adams was their enemy when it came to states and Indian policy. Jackson had encouraged Georgia to do this, to go about surveying the land, that the first treaty that was signed was legitimate. So that lines up Jackson as a friend to the state of Georgia and a friend to the idea of treaties that will survey land, turn it over to whites, and then possibly with the potential of upright removal. Again, this goes back Jackson as a man who is in favor of expansion to the Creek War. The Creek War within the war, during the War of 1812. Foreign policy proves to be another troublesome area for John Quincy Adams in office, which is ironic because his reputation is as a great diplomatist, one of maybe the most successful secretaries of state in American history. He believes that improvement comes from trade, expansion into new foreign markets. Domestic ideas of revolution and copying the United States are ideas for export. Again, not the first person to come up with that idea. And his first annual message, he recommends the appointment to what's called the First Pan-American Conference, which will take place in Panama, really Colombia. There's no Panama formally yet, but it's the territory of Panama within the new nation of Gran Colombia, as it's called at the time. The idea of the conference is the brainchild of Simón Bolívar, who is known as the great liberator of South America. Henry Clay had supported the actions of the revolutions and of Bolívar himself. It was a great idea that the breakup of the old Spanish world in Central and South America was going to promote American trade with those individual nations, not just we're dealing with New Spain, we're dealing with, again, these new independent countries. If we don't move in, and this is practical politics, Clay says, Great Britain will. They will gravitate towards other foreign countries, and then they'll move in if we hesitate to begin negotiations. And that might gravitate towards, again, we have a good rapport with Great Britain in the 1820s. It's not great, but it's improved since the War of 1812. Both men are interested, Adams and Clay, in the possibility of, wait for it, a construction of a canal through Panama, only 80 years ahead of their time. Martin Van Buren settles in on the idea that criticizing the participation, American participation in this conference, will score political points. And so he raises this idea, who are we talking to? What kinds of people are we talking to at this Pan-American conference? Calhoun says if it flops, or we don't show, or we don't do well or get anything out of it, it's a way to repudiate and get rid of Clay. Van Buren says it is a golden opportunity for the upcoming 1828 campaign. Some senators who are leaning toward support of Jackson, Senators Hayne and Benton of Missouri, argue that the meeting might bring about something that Jefferson and Washington had warned us about, entangling alliances with foreign nations. So no matter what, it's not going to go well for Adams. In what seems to be a practical idea whose time has come, nope, you don't get that. To win over the South, they play the race card. Participation in the conference means associating with mixed race regimes in Central and South America. Worse still, these nations had abolished upon their independence slavery. How could we sit down with abolitionist nations like this? Discussion of the slave trade, stopping the slave trade, which we don't participate in, but some folks like Great Britain want us to help stop those nations that still engage in the slave trade by using our Navy to intercept those ships that are going from West Africa to the Caribbean. Bless you. So, what critics of the possibility of going to the conference said? What would happen if, God forbid, Haiti shows up? Which would make sense. The first independent Black republic in the Western Hemisphere. Independence since 1804. The United States, we don't recognize it till what? Civil War. Both the House and Senate debate the bill, debate the funding, and the vote that would be necessary to participate in this conference, and they stall. And the stall causes a delay, which keeps the American delegates in the United States. So we don't get there in time anyway. The Panama Conference comes to very little in the end anyway. And probably because, I don't want to say because we weren't there, but there isn't a lot accomplished either way. Would it have made a difference if the U.S. was there? We can't say. It's a counterfactual argument. So there are issues that you think John Quincy Adams would have a great deal of success in foreign policy. Next time we'll talk about dealing with the nation of Mexico and the Caribbean, reopening the British West Indies for American trade. It's going to take a page from the success that we had negotiating with the Anglo-American Convention. But of course, Adams's actions as Secretary of State, where he snubbed the British who want to cooperate with the Monroe Doctrine, kind of come back to haunt us. And then, of course, in the 1826 elections, the so-called midterm elections, you can then gauge how successful the opposition to John Quincy Adams is, and then you see the writing on the wall. But the Adams people, the Jackson people, are not finished. They're going to try to basically torpedo John Quincy Adams by introducing a new high tariff that they know will be controversial and put him, Adams, in a very much a lose-lose situation.